half a century elapsed between the period of national consolidation, described in the last chapter, and the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. In this half century, European nations achieved their greatest power in global politics, developed their leading role in the global economy, and also exerted their maximum influence upon peoples outside Europe. For Europe and the European world, the years 1871 to 1914 were marked by hitherto unparalleled material and industrial growth, international peace, domestic stability, the advance of constitutional, representative, and democratic government, and continued faith in science, reason, and progress. But in these very years in politics, economics, philosophy, and the arts, there were also new trends that challenged or began to undermine the liberal premises and tenets of Europe's expansive political and cultural power. Meanwhile, a new wave of European imperialism spread across Africa and Asia, creating new colonial empires, new global economic connections, and new international and cultural conflicts. All of these developments contributed to and reflected the European ascendancy before 1914, and all produced a legacy that has decisively influenced the modern world down to our own time. For purposes of historical analysis, we are separating the European ascendancy in this complex era into different thematic strands. This chapter therefore examines economic and political trends in Europe after 1871. The next describes new European social and cultural movements that became influential during this period, and the following chapter discusses the worldwide impact of European imperialism. By 1914, the institutions and ideas of modern European civilization were spreading across most of the world, but these same institutions and ideas were also facing new critical challenges from within Europe and from people on other continents who resented the European domination of their economies, governments, and cultures. 1041, 583, 68. The concept of the modern civilized world, materialistic and non-materialistic ideals. With the extension of the nation-state system, Europe was more clearly divided among self-conscious political entities that jealously guarded their borders and sovereign interests. Its unity lay in a kind of modern historical convergence that was moving Europeans towards similar ways of social life and similar cultural beliefs, despite the growth of nationalism, which, on a deeper level, expressed commonly held assumptions about human societies. This convergence also developed in countries where large numbers of Europeans continued to immigrate, including the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Europe and its social cultural offshoots constituted what Europeans and North Americans increasingly called the civilized world, or the West. Other regions, mostly in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, were described by Europeans as backward. Europeans and the descendants of Europeans in other regions of the world were thus extremely conscious and inordinately proud of their civilization in the half-century before 1914. They believed it to be the well-deserved outcome of centuries of progress. Viewing themselves as the most advanced branch of mankind in the most important areas of human endeavor, they assumed that all people should respect the same social ideals, that insofar as other peoples were unwilling or unable to adopt them, they were labeled backward, and that insofar as they adopted European ways, they became modern and civilized in their turn. Such ideas shaped the ideology and practice of imperialism, which entered a dynamic new phase in the late 19th century. The ideals of European civilization, 1042. The ideals of this European or Western civilization were in part materialistic. If Europeans and Westerners considered their civilization to be better in 1900 than in 1800, or better than the ways of non-Western peoples at the same time, it was because they took pride in having more wealth and a higher standard of living, which gave them more kinds of food and clothing, new household comforts, and better sanitary facilities. Europeans also saw clear signs of material progress in their modern ocean liners, railroads, streetcars, and telegraph systems. And after about 1880, they were beginning to use telephones and electric lights. But the ideal of civilization, as Europeans defined it, was by no means exclusively materialistic. Knowledge as such, correct or truthful knowledge, was held to be a civilized attainment, scientific knowledge of nature, in place of superstition or demonology. Geographical knowledge, by which modern people were aware of the Earth as a whole, with its general contours and diverse inhabitants. The ideal was also profoundly moral, derived from Christianity, but now secularized and detached from religion. An Englishman, Isaac Taylor, in his Ultimate Civilization, published in 1860, defined this moral ideal by listing the contrasting relics of barbarism that he thought would ultimately disappear from human history: polygamy, infanticide, legalized prostitution, capricious divorce, sanguinary and immoral games, infliction of torture, caste, and slavery. Several of these had been condemned and placed outside the approved customs of Europe, at least since the coming of Christianity, though prostitution was more or less tolerated in almost all European societies. Torture had gone out of use by about 1800, even in the illiberal European states, and legalized caste and slavery were gradually abolished by Western countries over the course of the 19th century. But numerous non-Western cultures, as Taylor described them in 1860, still allowed or tolerated 2 or 3 of the relics that he placed beyond the realm of civilized behavior. 584. Apart from these cultural conceptions of modern civilization, there were and are certain other indices, more purely quantitative, that sociologists worked out to show the level of advancement of a given society. One of these was the death rate, or number of persons per 1,043,000 of population who died each year. In England, France, and Sweden, the true death rate, or death rate regardless of the proportion of infants and old people who are most susceptible to death, fell from about 25 per 1,000 per year before 1850 to 19 in 1914 and 18 in the 1930s. Indeed, before the Second World War, it stood seemingly stabilized at about 18 in all countries of northwestern Europe, the United States, and the British Dominions. Death rates in countries not modern have usually run over 40 even in favorable times. A closely related index was infant mortality, which fell rapidly after 1870 in all countries affected by medical science. Thus, a woman under more modern conditions had to go through pregnancy and childbirth less often to produce the same number of surviving children. Another index of improving conditions was life expectancy, or the age that a person at birth had an even chance of attaining. In England, life expectancy at birth rose from 40 years in the 1840s to 59 in 1933 and to 80 by 2015. In India, in 1931, it was less than 27 years. It had risen to about 68 by 2015. Still another index was the literacy rate, or proportion of persons above a certain age, such as 10, able to read and write. In northwestern Europe by 1900, the literacy rate approached 100, whereas in some countries of the world at that time, it had still not risen very far above 0. A further basic index of social change could be found in the productivity of labor, or amount produced by one worker in a given expenditure of time. This is often difficult to compute, especially for earlier periods for which statistical data are lacking. In the 1930s, however, the productivity of a farmer in Denmark was over 10 times that of a farmer in Albania. All northwestern Europe was above the European average in this respect, with the exception of Ireland, whereas Ireland, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and all Eastern Europe fell below it. Indices of advancement. Rising standards of living 1044. The essence of civilized living, or of a good life, has doubtless always evolved in the intangibles, in the way in which people use their minds, and in the attitudes they form toward others, or toward the conditions and planning of their own lives. The intangibles, however, can carry quite different meanings for persons of different cultures or ideologies. On the quantitative criteria, there is less disagreement. People in almost all societies wish to lower the death rate, raise the literacy rate, and increase the productivity of human exertion. Whatever we might say about the intangible qualities of a civilized society, if we apply quantitative or sociological indices alone, we can say that for about 4 decades after 1870, Europe was the political, economic, and cultural center of a modern civilization that was developing new material advantages, improving the standard of living, and expanding rapidly around the world. 585-1045. The zones, of modern societies aware 1870. It may be more accurate to say that a certain region of Europe was the real center of this expanding modern civilization. For there were really two Europes in the late 19th century, an inner zone and an outer. A Frenchman writing in the 1920s about the two Europes that had risen since 1870 called the inner zone the Europe of steam and bounded it by an imaginary line joining Glasgow, Stockholm, Danzig, Trieste, Florence, and Barcelona. It included not only Great Britain, but Belgium, Germany, France, northern Italy, and the western portions of the Austrian Empire. Virtually all heavy European industry was located in this zone. Here the railway network was thickest. Here the wealth of Europe was concentrated, in the form both of a high living standard and of accumulations of capital. Here likewise were almost all the laboratories and scientific activity of Europe. Here, in the same zone, lay the strength of constitutional and parliamentary government and of liberal, humanitarian, socialist, and reformist movements of many kinds. In this zone, the death rate was low, life expectancy was high, conditions of health and sanitation were at their best, literacy was almost universal, productivity of labor was impressive. To the same zone, for practical purposes, belonged certain regions of large-scale European settlement overseas, including the post-Civil War United States. Train in the Snow by Claude Monet, French, 1840 to 1926. Trains became one of the new symbols of modernity during the 19th century, but few artists saw them as appropriate subjects for paintings. Monet and other Impressionists, however, wanted to apply their artistic techniques to the familiar objects of everyday life, including the iron shapes of a passing locomotive. In this typical Impressionist rendering of modern technology, the solid mass of the train melts into the play of light and the indeterminate grays of a dull winter day. Heritage Images, Getty Images. 586 were landlords, often absentees. Most people in the outer zone increasingly supported themselves after 1870 by selling grain, livestock, wool, or lumber to the more industrialized inner zone, but they were two. 746. The outer zone included most of Ireland, most of the Iberian and Italian peninsulas, and all Europe east of what was then Germany, Bohemia, and Austria proper. The outer zone was agricultural, though the productivity of agriculture per farm worker or per acre was far less than in the inner zone. The people were poorer, more illiterate, and more likely to die young. The wealthy poor to purchase many manufactured products in return. To obtain capital, the outer zone societies borrowed in London or Paris. Their social and political philosophies were characteristically imported from Germany or other Western European cultures. They borrowed engineers and technicians from the first zone to build bridges and install telegraph systems, and they sent their youth to universities in the first zone to study medicine or other professions. Many areas of European settlement overseas, for example in Latin America and the agrarian parts of the United States, may also be thought of at that time as belonging to this outer zone. The outer zone, 69. Basic demography. The increase of Europe's population, 1047. Beyond the European world lay a third zone, the immense reaches of Asia and Africa, all viewed as backward by the standards or cultural assumptions of late 19th century Europe, with the exception of modernizing Japan. And it was these areas of the world after 1870 that became most widely colonized by Europe and most disrupted by the new imperialism of the major European powers. Much of the world's history since 1870 could be written as a recurring story of the economic and cultural relations or interactions among these three evolving zones. But it is necessary in all human matters to guard against formulas that are too simple and also to recognize the constant changes as well as continuities in the histories of all human societies. European and world population growth since 1650. All continents except Africa gained enormously in population in the 3 centuries following 1650. But it was Europe that grew the most. There is little doubt that the proportion of Europeans in the world's total, including those of European origin in other continents, reached its maximum for all time between 1850 and the Second World War. Broad estimates for global population trends, beginning with 1650, are given in the table on p. 588. The causes of the rise in population after 1650 cannot be positively known. Some of them obviously operated in Asia as well as Europe. In Europe, the organized sovereign states, as established in the 17th century, put an end to a long period of civil wars, stopping the chronic violence and marauding, with the accompanying insecurity of agriculture and family life, which were more deadly than wars fought between governments. Similarly, the Tokugawa shogunate, 1600–1668, kept peace in Japan, and the Manchu or Qing dynasty, 1644–1912, brought a long period of order in China. The British rule in India and the Dutch in Java greatly reduced the autonomous power of local rulers, but it also curbed internal violence and famines, thus helping populations to grow very rapidly. All such factors, which allowed more people to remain alive longer, also favored the stability of families and the birth and raising of children. Death rates could fall and birth rates could rise from similar causes. The great exception to the global rise of population was Africa, where the slave trade removed over 10 million people and what would have been an even larger number of their descendants in 3 or 4 centuries, and where slave raiding led to the disruption of African cultures. In the Americas, the native Indians were devastated by diseases brought from Europe, to which at first they had no immunity. In Europe, sooner than elsewhere, other causes of growth were at work beyond the maintenance of civil peace. They included liberation from certain endemic afflictions, beginning with the subsiding of bubonic plague in the 17th century and the use of vaccination against smallpox in the 18th. Agricultural improvement produced 588 improved living conditions, in 1,050 more food, notably in England after about 1750. The improvement of transportation by road, canal, and railroad made localized famine a thing of the past, because food could be moved into areas of temporary shortage. With the Industrial Revolution, larger populations could subsist in Europe by importing food from overseas. In the cities of Europe and North America, by 1900, the supply of pure drinking water and facilities for the disposal of garbage and sewage were better than in the past. Hence, population grew for several generations more substantially in Europe and its offshoots than elsewhere. The approximate percentages in the table on page 588 show that Asia, by these estimates, increased less than threefold between 1650 and 1900, but Europe increased fourfold, and the total number of Europeans, including the descendants of those who migrated to other continents, multiplied fivefold. The ascendancy of European civilization in the 2.5 centuries after 1650 was due in some measure to demographic growth. But while in 1900, the proportion of Europeans in all continents was approaching a third of the human race, after 1900, this proportion began to fall. By the early 21st century, it could be projected that Europeans would constitute only a tenth of the human beings on the planet in the year 2100. 2051, Stabilization of European Population. The stabilization and relative decline of the European population followed from a fall in the birth rate. As early as 1830, the birth rate began noticeably to drop in France, with the result that France, long the most populous European state, was surpassed in population by Germany about 1870, by the British Isles about 1895, and by Italy about 1930. France, once thought to be decadent for this reason, was in fact only the leading country in a changing population cycle through which other European countries also began to pass. The birth rate, which had fallen below 30 per 100 in France in the 1830s, fell to that level in Sweden in the 1880s, in England in the 1890s, and in Germany and the Netherlands between 1900 and 1910. After the Second World War, there was a temporary rise, but by the early 21st century, the birth rate was well below 15 per 1,000 in Europe, Japan, and North America, hardly sufficient to maintain existing population levels. In much of the rest of the world, it was still well over 20 or even 30. The reduced birth rate is not a mere dry statistical item, nor does it affect populations merely in the mass. It is one of the indices of a more modern industrialized civilization, first appearing in that inner European zone in which the other indices were also highest, and thence spreading outward in a kind of wave. Concretely, a low birth rate in the 19th century meant that families averaged from 2 to 4 children, where in former times, families might consist of 10 children or even more. The low birth rate reflects the small family system, and few institutions were more fundamental to modern life. The principal means used to hold down the birth rate or to limit the family was the practice of contraception. But the true causes or reasons why parents wanted to limit their families were deeply embedded in the social patterns of modernizing societies. Historical demographers have detected a European family pattern as far back as the 17th century. It was a pattern in which, in comparison to other societies, Europeans married later, and a larger number never married at all. Late marriage shortened the number of years during which a woman bore children and enabled young people to acquire skills or accumulate savings, as in tools and household goods, before setting up new families. Evidence indicating the use of various forms of contraception can be found in the 18th century among the upper classes by study of the number and spacing of their children. 589, a European family pattern. In the great cities of the 19th century, in which standards of life for the working classes often collapsed, the effect might at first be a proliferation of offspring. But life in the city, under crowded conditions of housing, also set a premium on the small family. After about 1880, child in 52. The practice seems to have spread to other social classes during and after the French Revolution, in part because the new Napoleonic Code, 1804, required that inheritances be divided among all sons and daughters. The French peasants, many of them owners of land, began to limit themselves to 2 or 3 children, in order that all children, by inheritance, marriage, and dowries, might remain in the same economic and social position as their landowning parents. It was thus the quest for economic security and higher living standards that led to the reduced birth rate in France and subsequently in other parts of Europe. Labor became much less frequent among the working classes. When children ceased to earn part of the family income, parents tended to have fewer of them. About the same time, governments in the advanced countries and nation-states began to require universal compulsory schooling. The number of years spent in education, and hence in economic dependency upon parents, grew longer and longer until it became common even for young adults to be still engaged in study. Each child represented many years of expense for its parents. The growing need for extensive education and the desire of parents to give their children every possible advantage in a competitive world were probably the most basic causes of voluntary limitation of the family. Hardly less basic was the desire to lighten the burdens upon mothers. The small family system, together with the decline of infant mortality, because they combined to free women from the interminable bearing and tending of infants, probably did more than anything else to improve the position of women in modern societies. Freed at least in part from the traditional cycles of pregnancy and childcare, middle-class women were eventually able to pursue advanced education, new professions, and new kinds of social or political activities. The use of contraception also spread widely among the working class during the early 20th century. Demographic research in England, for example, suggests that almost 70% of working-class couples were using contraception by the 1930s, compared to fewer than 20% in 1900. Life in the City, 1053. The effects of the small family system upon total population became manifest only slowly. More people lived on into the middle and older age groups, and the fall of the birth rate was gradual, so that in all the leading countries, total numbers continued to rise. Except in France, which hardly grew between 1900 and 1945. Despite several immense wars and other social disruptions, the persistent demographic pattern was superabundant increase. In 5 generations, between 1800 and 1950, a population of about 200 million Europeans grew into roughly 700 million Europeans around the globe. Because productivity increased even more rapidly, the standard of living for most of these Europeans rose in spite of the increase of numbers, and there was no general problem of overpopulation. Growth of cities and urban life. Where did so many people go? Some stayed in the rural areas where most people had always lived. Rural populations in the inner zone became more dense, turning to the more intensive agriculture of truck gardening or dairy farming, leaving products like wool and cereal grains to be raised elsewhere and then imported. But it is 590 estimated that of every 7 persons added to the Western European population, only 1 stayed on the land. Of the other 6, 1 left Europe altogether and 5 went to the growing cities. Luntown 54, The Gleaners by Jean-Francois Millet, French, 1814-1875. Although France, like other European countries, became a more urban society over the course of the 19th century, many French people still lived and worked in the countryside, as Millet showed in this painting of poor peasant women who gleaned the fields for a few stalks of grain. Godong, Getty Images. The 19th century city was rapidly reshaped by railroads. The new railroad systems made it possible to concentrate manufacturing in large towns, to which bulky goods, such as foods and fuel, could now be moved in great volume. The growth of cities between 1850 and 1914 was phenomenal. In England, 2/3 of the people lived in places of 20,000 or less in 1830. In 1914, 2/3 lived in places of 20,000 or more. Germany, the historic land of archaic towns carried over from the Middle Ages, rivaled England after 1870 in modern industrial urbanization. Whereas in 1840, only London and Paris had 1 million people, the same could be said by 1914 of other major European cities such as Berlin, Vienna, St. Petersburg, and Moscow. Some places, like the English Midlands and the Ruhr Valley in Germany, became a mass of contiguous smaller cities, vast urban agglomerations divided only by municipal lines. 5 and 91. The evolving demographic pattern in 19th century European bourgeois families may be seen in this portrait of a Victorian-era English family sitting in their garden. The declining number of children eventually gave women more time and 10 tens and 55 freedom for diverse activities because they were less tied to long cycles of pregnancies and childrearing. General Photographic Agency. The great cities set the tone of modern society. City life was impersonal and anonymous. People were uprooted, less tied to home or church than in the country. They lacked the country person's feeling of deference for aristocratic families. They lacked the sense of self-help characteristic of older rural communities. It was in the city that the daily newspaper press, which spread rapidly in the wake of the telegraph after 1850, found its most habitual readers. The so-called yellow or sensational press appeared about 1900. Articulate public opinion was formed in the cities, and city people were on the whole disrespectful of tradition and more receptive to new ideas, having in many cases deliberately altered their own lives by moving from the country or from smaller towns. It is hardly surprising that the new conditions of urban life fostered the spread of socialism among the industrial masses in 592 European cities. Some of the more vehement nationalisms that arose after 1870 were also stimulated by city life, for people felt increasingly detached from all institutions except the state. At the same time, city life, by its greater facilities for schooling, reading, and discussion, made for a more informed, engaged, and enlightened public opinion. Impact of urban life, then 56, migration from Europe, 1850 to 1940. During the same period in which cities were growing, almost 60 million people left Europe altogether, of whom possibly a fifth sooner or later returned. This vast movement of people is called the Atlantic migration because Oz all crossed that ocean except those who moved to European settler societies in Africa, Australia, and New Zealand, or from European to Asian Russia. It towers above all other European migrations in magnitude and possibly also in significance, for it was by this means that earlier colonial offshoots of Europe were transformed into new, larger societies that carried the very strong influence of European political, social, religious, and cultural traditions. All parts of Europe contributed to the migration, as shown in the table below, which comprises the years from 1850 to 1940. Before 1850, the mass movement had scarcely begun, though by that time, over 1 million immigrants had entered the United States since the close of the Napoleonic Wars. After 1940, the character of intercontinental migration was greatly transformed. In recent decades, since the Second World War, there have been large migrations into Europe from Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, and into the Americas from places outside Europe. But in the century before 1940, the migration of European peoples was a key force in the dissemination of European institutions and cultures. The Atlantic migration. It is hard to give accurate or precise figures for emigration from Europe. In the statistical sources, the English, Scots, Welsh, and Irish are usually mixed within the broad category of the British Isles. The Poles, Czechs, other Slavic peoples, Hungarians, East 593 1057 European Jews, and others were not counted in such groups before the First World War. They were simply included among emigrants from the Russian, Austro-Hungarian, and German empires. Millions of Jews, Irish, Poles, and many thousands of others are therefore invisible in the figures, which also includes several million Russians who moved from the European to Asian parts of Russia. It must be remembered that there were also many international migrations that did not involve Europeans. For a few years after 1850, enslaved Africans were still brought illegally to the United States and Brazil. Workers went from India to the West Indies and South Africa, and many Chinese settled in the United States and Southeast Asia. With these limitations in the global data, the table on immigrant destinations shows the main patterns of European emigration in the 90 years preceding the Second World War. The British and Irish went to the British dominions and the United States. The Italians divided between the United States and Latin America. Spaniards settled overwhelmingly in the Spanish-American republics, and the Portuguese settled in Brazil. The Germans moved overwhelmingly to the United States, though some went to Argentina and Brazil. The extraordinary preponderance of the United States is apparent. At the same time, it should be noted that almost half of the European migration went to other countries around the world. The new countries received the following influxes of people. 1,059 immigrants could enter only under quotas. Immigrants from Asia were generally banned from entering the United States, and the European quotas were lowest for Eastern and Southern Europe, the areas from which most emigration had been coming. Causes of the exodus. 594 Migration from Europe, 1850 to 1940. About 60 million people left Europe in the century preceding the Second World War, distributing themselves as shown in the diagram above. See chart on P 594. About half went to the United States, but the migration of European peoples also built up European societies in other regions of the world. These expanding overseas European societies included many non-European peoples and cultural histories, and they all developed new institutions and cultures that also differed from the evolving national cultures in Europe. They remained closely connected to Europe. In 1060, however, because of enduring cultural influences, and because they produced food and raw materials for European markets, borrowed European capital, and bought manufactured goods from European factories, the overseas European societies and migrations thus helped to support Europe's economic ascendancy and to expand the global economic system. 595. The mass migration of people is one of the distinctive social patterns of modern history, and such migrations have continually reshaped societies in all parts of the world. This Italian woman, Anna Sciacchitano, who arrived in New York with her children in 1908, was part of the vast emigration out of Europe that deeply affected the social and economic development of post-colonial nations in the Americas. Bettman, Getty Images. In Europe, there were many conditions propelling emigrants outward. Physically, the steamship made it easier and cheaper to cross the sea, and the new railroads helped people to get to the ports, as well as to distribute themselves after landing in the new countries. Economically, people in the lower social classes could more easily afford a long journey. People migrated to improve their material circumstances, but some high points in the wave of emigration coincided with high points in the business cycle in Europe, when jobs in Europe were plentiful and wages were at their highest. There was also social flight in times of economic ruin, or 1061 starvation, as in the emigration from Ireland after 1846. In the Great Potato Famine of 1845 to 1849, nearly 1 million Irish died of starvation and disease, and more than 1.5 million emigrated to the United States in the next few years. After the revolutions of 1848, a certain number of Europeans also left Europe for political reasons, and later on to avoid compulsory military service. The best example of flight from segregation and discrimination, and from direct persecution in government-encouraged pogroms, was the emigration of the Jews of Russia and Russian Poland, of whom 1.5 million moved to the United States in the 15 years preceding the First World War. But perhaps the most basic historical factor in the whole European exodus was the underlying liberalism of the age. Never before, nor since, had people been legally so free to move. Old laws requiring skilled workmen to stay in their own countries were repealed, as in England in 1824. The old semi-communal agricultural villages, with collective rights and obligations, holding individuals to their birthplaces and native groups, fell into disuse, except in Russia. The disappearance of serfdom allowed the peasants of Eastern Europe to change residences without obtaining a lord's permission. Governments permitted their subjects to emigrate, to take with them their savings of shillings, marks, kronen, or lire, and to change nationality by becoming naturalized in their new homes. The rise of personal 5996, a 1062 liberty and social mobility in Europe, as well as the hope for more liberties and opportunities in America, made possible the great European emigration. This mass movement of people was all the more remarkable because it took place by private initiative and at private expense. The new national states did not initiate or organize the migration. Individuals, families, and small local groups, to borrow the metaphor of one authority, simply detached themselves atom by atom from the mass of Europe, crossed the seas on their own, and reattached themselves atom by atom to the accumulating mass of the New World. The mass migrations of the late 19th century thus launched a worldwide movement of people that continues to the present day, grows in importance, and remains one of the most characteristic social patterns of modern world history.